So we're in your United States history book. We're in chapter 22, section 5, part 2 actually. And we're going to be going into a little more on the important battles of World War I as America now has entered the front lines of the war in Europe. America taking like over 2.5 years before Woodrow Wilson declared war. We went over that and on to now being involved in the war. Large numbers of Americans now are beginning to reach the front lines, the soldiers in the war, and General Pershing here is now in charge of the American troops and also putting some of the troops under the charge of Commander Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French commander. And so now the tide of the war is beginning to turn, and the Americans' division stormed, fortified Cantigny, and in the midst of that, Americans come in with like a storm and pushing German troops back. June 1918, the 2nd and 3rd Divisions come in from America and joining the French on the Marne River. It was a river that flows to the Seine at Paris and helping driving the Germans from the Belleau-Wood area, which was very important because Germany was right at 40 miles away from taking over Paris, France, the capital of France. So in July, the American forces helped to stop the German advance at Chateau Thierry on the Marne. We have again victory, another victory on the Marne. And with this victory now, Germany are now not on the offense, they're on the defense. They're actually retreating. So our counteroffensive against Germany, July 18th, 1918, Marshal Foch launches this counteroffensive to push back the Germans from the Marne River in France. And so we're headed, most of our troops now are on the French border in France, at that point. And so also another of our division attacked the Hindenburg Line, which is a lot of trenches and dugouts that Germany had, and pushing the Germans back and also capturing Saint Mihiel, so this was the fortifications that Germany's had since the beginning, practical since September of 1918. So this was a major accomplishment for American troops. And then the General Pershing with 9 American troops and 4 French divisions that in 3 days swept through these wire entanglements and these fortified ridges and captured this whole entire area. So as we come in, we're just right, we're on the offense now. And before, all of the allies were on the defense, and things were not going good for them. So, and then the Meuse-Argonne campaign, this would be very important. So most of our troops that went over to fight in World War I fought in the Argonne forest here. So in the midst of this forest, it was just heavily fortified with all kinds of barbed wire and entrenchments and hidden machine guns, as Germany was involved in this area to attack France. And now we're going into 1 million Americans took part and going in, and 100,000 were killed or wounded in the Argonne campaign. So whenever you think of World War I, think of the Argonne campaign, the Meuse-Argonne campaign and the Argonne Forest. That's probably where they fought, and many died and were killed. 100,000 were either killed or wounded. More ammunition was fought than any other war of America, and they had 47 days of fierce fighting, and they only advanced 23 miles because they're in this dense forest, right? They finally reached Sedan and the German communication lines. Now the Germany would have to end up signing an armistice if we get through this forest. And here, I began a picture of the Argonne Forest there on the border of France. Right here, you see where they fought. This little area here was very tough, very vigorous fighting, as I could say. And a lot of Americans are not alive now from World War I, of course, but a lot of lives were lost, and a lot of Americans know about the forest, the Argonne Forest, when they think of World War I. Now I wanted to go over Alvin York, and I just love this. He was a war hero. He lived 1887 to 1964. So who was Alvin York? Well, he was a tall, redhead mountain boy from Tennessee. He was a sharpshooter hunter, liked to hunt wild turkeys and wild pheasants, in the midst of all this. And he would go actually into competitions for sharpshooting, and he always would win, He also, he was a new Christian. He actually was born again right before the war. I mean, his mother was a Christian, but he was kind of like at that age, of just kind of, getting involved in, the party and drinking and all these things back then. And then he got saved. And so when World War I began, as a young man, he hesitated to go into the war because he thought, well, should I be killing somebody? Shouldn't I be at peace? How can I understand what the Bible says? And he was looking to God's Spirit to lead him in the midst of all this. And finally, he was convinced in his heart it was duty to defend his family and to defend his friends in the midst of a war that really Germany declared on us, And so he decided to go into the war. On October 8th, 1918, Corporal York and 16 other men, he's in the midst of the Argonne Forest that I told you about. And so he has, he's in with there's 17 of them, and they're sent in and dismantled because there were machine guns going off in all these machine gun nests all the way through the forest. So they were sent to dismantle some of these machine guns. Well, 9 out of the 17 men were gunned down by the Germans. And this left the young Corporal Alvin in charge. Here he is, in charge as, basically thinking, not being a general or anything, that the rest of the young men, they were afraid to death. Now there were only 8 of them. And one of his best friends gets shot down, and he becomes realizing that he needs to defend his basically 6 other friends. There's 7 of them now. And so in the midst of this, so he finds himself in a strategic position. He runs through all the German, where the machine guns are off. He runs over and he gets someplace, the kind of a picture right here. He gets someplace where they can't, that's a strategic position, like his hunting position, where he hunted wild turkeys, and he begins to just pick off the German soldiers one by one, shooting. And it was kind of weird because the Germans didn't know what was going on, because he would gobble like a turkey, because that's what he used to do for the turkeys. He'd say, gobble, 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 and a turkey would poke up his head and then he'd shoot him. Gobble, 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 another turkey would poke up his head and he'd shoot him. And that's the way he was shooting the soldiers, like he was hunting, And so he, after killing 20 or more Germans one by one, shooting them one by one, he just had his rifle and his pistol and shooting them. Finally, the German officer, he got to the German officer who rose up his white flag and said he was surrendering to him. So the German officer surrenders to Alvin and his, comrades. And so what happens then? Let's go on to the next thing. While he had the gun in the German's back, Alvin York convinced the German to command the rest of the Germans to forced to surrender. The thing is, most Germans cannot speak English, but this German soldier, this German general, could speak English, and he was afraid to death. And he also, Alvin could understand him. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened. So, especially you could imagine Alvin with a southern accent and saying, hey, you need to surrender. Well, anyway, he had the gun in the German's back and said, okay, you need to surrender your troops. And so he did. The German general surrendered his troops. And as they marched back, so they had to march through the forest in this area, marched back to the American lines, Alvin York, Corporal York, and his parade, he had a parade of 132 enemy soldiers. Needless to say, there's 7 of them, 7, young soldiers. They're all young. And with York coming in with the general in charge, They were surrendering. So they, as they walked through these lines, more and more Germans were surrendering. And then he said he made the German prisoners that he had, 132 of them, carry all the machine guns to give them to the Americans. And if there were any wounded American soldiers along the way, he'd make the Germans carry the wounded American soldiers so that they could carry them in to get help, to get a first aid. So here he's coming in carrying, Germans carrying in wounded American soldiers for help and carrying machine guns to surrender them. And they're walking through the forest. They came into the headquarters of the American headquarters, and Marshal Foch, the head of the French forces, basically said, "This is the greatest accomplishment by any private soldier in all the armies of Europe." He said, "I've never seen anything like this. This young man bringing in all of these German prisoners and all of these machine guns and bringing in all these wounded." And so he was just amazed, you can imagine. And so Alvin, he became, from that time, Sergeant York. They made him a sergeant, of course. And so he became the most famous American hero, actually the most famous hero of World War I, as all of not only the French and the English, and they all knew, even the Germans knew that God was definitely with this American hero, and he was a brand new born-again Christian that God sent into this war. Not only did he save his buddies' lives and stand for America, but he also saved the lives of the German prisoners. 132 of them were glad to be under and surrendering at that point, and he gave glory to God. And he said, "Man, I was just protecting my friends." What a deal. What a deal. I had to give that because there's movies about him. So it was the greatest American hero in World War I. Now, the surrender, Wilson. Now, as the armistice happened, Wilson was developing his 14 points. Of course, Woodrow Wilson was the president at this time. And so he also wanted to put together a League of Nations for peacetime, to basically League of Nations, to bring the nations in so that they wouldn't have any more war, that they could actually arbitrate in situations so they wouldn't get to the point of having to declare war. So it was a good intention that wouldn't work. Let's just say that. The League of Nations never did come to be worth anything. In fact, the United States would not even support the League of Nations at this time. So anyway, about Wilson's 14 points. First of all, prepared the public list of American war aims in the midst of this to see, well, what are our aims now as Germany surrenders. He gave a speech to Congress on January 8th, 1918, listing these 14 points. This was in America. And he said, the only possible program of world peace is this. So he was prepared in the midst. One thing about Woodrow Wilson, he was a scholar. He was, basically a professor type president, but he also was, convinced about globalism now at this point, and convinced that this would be the only way you could handle, and he really thought a humanistic way that there could be peace. And, he was very liberal in a lot of ways, pretty much, and so leading into a socialistic America in the future. But anyway, let's talk about these 14 points. The first 5 points proposed a new program of international relationships, right? And he would open these peace treaties and freedom of the seas. So he said, we must have peace treaties, we must have freedom of seas, but we must have free internal trade, arms reductions, reducing our military arms really, and national self-determination, basically saying allowing nations to rule themselves or to govern themselves. So, which didn't work in a lot of these nations because they weren't prepared for this. But anyway, that was the first points, to have peace treaties, freedom of the seas, international trade, arms reduction, and national self-determination. The next 6 through 13 dealt with the political and territorial future of Russia and Eastern Europe, basically saying what's going to happen with Russia now, what lands are going to be taken from Germany, away from Germany, what lands will be territories of Russia. So, and Russia at the time was very sad, because Russia at that time was under Lenin, the Bolsheviks had just taken over violently the Russian hierarchy, the Russian basically czar and basically they were having violence in Russia at this time. So anyway, going on with the 14th point, Wilson believed was the most important point, and this read, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. So he was saying, basically, League of Nations will be basically pointing later on to the United Nations, But at this time, the basically all of the governments of all of these nations would not really be able to tolerate a League of Nations in this sense. But anyway, this is what he wanted. He said was most important, is to be under specific covenants, be able to have some kind of peacemaking organization. So here's a picture of his 14 points: open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removing economic barriers, reducing armaments, adjusting colonial claims, what to do with the territories in Russia, preservations of the Belgium sovereignty, restoration of French territory, redrawing Italian frontiers, the division of Austria-Hungary now, redrawing the Balkans. Remember, this all started back way with the Archduke Ferdinand being assassinated. This whole war, if they could have had some kind of peace negotiation, started with the assassination of an Austria-Hungary royalty. He was going to actually become the next royal leader in the midst of Austria being assassinated, onto now the Balkans and Serbia, that whole area, what were going to be their boundaries, now what limitations would be on Turkey. Remember the Ottoman Empire there in Turkey. Now, what would we do with Turkey at this point? And the establishment now was Poland being independent, the creation of the Association of Nations. A lot of things in the midst, a lot of things that he must do. Let me turn this a little bit so you can see. There you go. It's these 14 points over here. And here we have a picture down at the bottom here that says, basically, here is, basically, the United States here with Wilson here trying to tell a Europe that's mad at each other, a Europe that is ready for war and has been debilitated, especially Germany. Would they listen to Woodrow Wilson or not? Would they follow the League of Nations or would they not? It says, Father, I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my 14-point SWATs. Yeah, don't know. The collapse of the Central Powers. So on November 1918, the Central Powers began to collapse, and there was a mutiny in the German Navy. This is right at the end of the war there, and a revolution began in various parts of Germany. Remember the whole thing about Elvin York and the Germans? Well, a lot of the Germans didn't know what was going on, because there was a lot of mutiny now in the Navy that was like, they didn't have control. As the Germany was getting hit, they didn't have control like they did before of the German soldiers. And revolutions were happening in parts of Germany that really wanted out of the war. So the German government appealed to President Wilson for an armistice. So he said, They heard of his 14 points and said, yeah, we'll take the 14 points. We're ready. We're ready to have an agreement. Armistice is an agreement, you know. And the terms of the armistice were given by the Supreme War Council of the Allies. And so the German officials were escorted behind the Allied lines to talk about this armistice. Well, the generals, especially General Pershing, that was head of the American Expeditionary Force, you know, he thought there's only unconditional surrender. There's not going to be an armistice. The Germans are just lying. So even though this was going on, he did not believe that this would end the war at all. So they kept on fighting. So that's kind of the thing that Pershing got in trouble later on. Like, why didn't you just know that, you know, stop the fighting at this point? But he was thinking, no, we can't, because this whole thing, this whole armistice is not going to be. So, and it could. He just thought the Germans, it was another way for the Germans to trick us, right? So, Marshal Foch, remember General Marshal Foch was the head of the French army, presented the terms of this armistice and said Germany had to evacuate all the occupied territory and withdraw all of their troops from west of the Rhine River. They had to evacuate. He said the strip of land 20 miles wide had to be a neutral zone. He also said the Allied troops were to be allowed to occupy the German territory now. And Germany was to renounce the treaties forced on Russia. No more did they have a force on Russia, taking Russia land, and Romania. So he's saying those treaties are null effect. The Brest treaty with Russia was non-effect. And so Germany was to return all of their Allied prisoners. All of their prisoners of war had to be returned. These were the terms of the armistice. You know, we're not talking about, you know, the total end of the war yet. Okay, the armistice. And General Pershing thinking, oh, this is not going to happen. Well, maybe he didn't realize that the German lines were having a lot of mutiny, and a lot of revolutions were happening too. So the Great War is over. So they had 72 hours to accept this armistice. And that's why the fighting went on. 72 days, or 72 hours, 3 days to wait to give us the answer if they're going to do this, you know, armistice. So on November 9th, the Kaiser, Wilhelm, he fled, and he abdicated his position, and he fled to the Netherlands, hiding out in neutral countries. So here the Kaiser, you know, the whole head of the German government, he decides to flee. So he's fleeing, and basically fled into a neutral country on 5 a.m. November 11th, 1918, in Champagne, France. Allied and German troop representatives met in a railroad car to sign this armistice. So here we have, in the midst of all this, in a railroad car, for goodness sakes, they signed an armistice agreement. And the document went into effect at 11 o'clock on the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day. So at 11 a.m., which is 11th hour, 11th day of the month, 11th month, November 11th, the Great War was over. So it went forth. The war is over. You know, the war now is over, and Germany has come to terms on the armistice. So here's some pictures of the war being over in the midst. Can you imagine? It's signed in a railroad car. Veterans Day. So now, on November 11th, Great Britain and France celebrate Armistice Day to this day to commemorate the end of their war, World War I. The Great War. In Canada, it's called Remembrance Day. But in the United States, the name was changed from Armistice Day to Veterans Day in 1954. So today we celebrate Veterans Day, which honors all men and women who have served in the United States Armed Forces on Veterans Day. So Merry Veterans Day goes back to the Great War, goes back to the war, World War I, right? Veterans Day.